Hello, friends. Welcome to Book Brilliant. This is Matt, and today I'm having a conversation with author Charles Sage. He is the author of a couple book series, one being Potter's War, as well as the Year of the Tiger series. But the one that I really focus on today is Potter's War. Right before we had this interview, World War III was trending on Twitter. A lot of people were freaked out with everything going on over in Israel and Iran, and so it made for great timing as the book, basically, to sum it up real short, is about draft dodgers of World War III. It's an idea and a concept I'm very fascinated in. If you like authors such as Clay Martin or Jack Carr, I think that you would like his books, Potter's Run, and like I said, the whole Potter's War series. So let's dive in with Charles Sage.
Today I've got on Charles Sage, author of this book that I read, Potter's Run. And I got to say, you reached out to me. You said, would you be interested in this book? And it's like, I don't know, man. It depends on what the book's about. And one thing that's been on my mind lately is World War III and a potential draft. So when I saw that this book covers that, I was like, you absolutely could send me this book and I will read it. So thank you for that, Charles. What can you go ahead and give me just a little bit of your background before we dive into anything with books here?
So I'm a pilot by profession. For the past 17 years, I've been flying government contract work overseas, specifically ISR, intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance aircraft in places like Iraq, Afghanistan, and multiple African locations. So I also spent 6 years in law enforcement, and I've been writing all my life and telling stories since I was a little kid. So um, that's about it in a nutshell.
Now you had a quick attempt at the military, is that correct?
Yeah, I did actually. I spent a little bit of time in the Air National Guard. I was trying to make it as my lifelong dream was to be a military pilot since I
Yeah.
was like 5 years old, and so I had to study for some of the eye exams to get in as an enlisted aircrew member. But I got
Yeah.
in as a C-130 loadmaster with the Air National Guard, and about halfway through my training, I wound up in a bad accident, crushed both heels, broke my back. So that ended any hope of my military flying career, at least as I saw it. There would be no A-10s flying through the Fulda Gap for Charles Sage. So I was done and trying to figure out what I was going to do with my life while I rehabilitated myself. And I saw you were into martial arts, and I got big into martial arts at that time strictly as a rehabilitation effort, and it is really the reason why I can walk normally today. The doctors at the time said I would probably always need a crutch and always have a limp. I don't think anybody notices my limp now because of what I was able to do with martial arts, and it got my body and my mind set after that accident. So
Yeah, I'm helping my martial arts teacher with his autobiography, and he actually broke his pelvis, like cracked it in two, and it took him out of martial arts for a little bit. He got back in, but most people don't know that when they meet him. And I just started reading this book. See if I can grab it out of my bag here. Karate Do, because I forget the guy who wrote it, but in it he's in his 90s when he wrote this book, and he basically said karate has helped him have a long life and ward off the flu and things like that. And he said how if he ever has a fever, he'll just do karate
yeah.
kicks and stuff, and it'll get the fever out of his body. And I'm like, I don't know about that, but it's worth a shot. Well, before I dive into this book and current events, because it's so timely, I try to ask people when I remember, and it can be somewhat of a tough question. But do you have a favorite book by chance?
Oh, that is a tough question because the answer would change by tomorrow, probably.
Exactly. Yeah.
So basically anything by Hemingway. I'm a big Louis L'Amour fan, also. Um, and I remember when I was fairly young, I read Alexander Solzhenitsyn's Gulag Archipelago. And I
Nice.
don't know if that would be a favorite book, but it's certainly one that had a big impact on my life and how I view the world today. So
So you read that before Jordan Peterson made it more famous?
I did. It was on my parents' shelf, and I remember I was in eighth grade, and I was reading it when I should have been reading other things in class, and I got caught by a teacher reading it, and the teacher wanted to yell at me and saw what it was and just kind of let it go.
Yeah, that's one of those books you read that at a young age that'll mold you for the rest of your life. Like
Yeah.
I've been in corporate meetings before kind of thinking like, geez, is anybody buying this? And then I realized, oh, these people probably didn't watch the movie Fight Club 50 times when they were 16 and it didn't
Yeah,
completely shape their world.
right.
So that's funny. Well, so this book, again, Potter's Run, what's nice about it is I thought, okay, well, if this is just a book about a guy giving the government the finger and saying, you're not going to draft my kids, like that's a cool enough story as it is. And I'll read that. But it was more than that because just multiple times reading it, I'd be like, huh, I didn't expect it to go this way. And okay, I didn't expect this to happen either. So I really like that aspect of it. The book is just, it's a good book. Um, do you want to talk a little bit, not to give anything away because I'm not, but I was blown away at the very end when you said that this was kind of close to some real life events from World War One. You'd mentioned the book Shootout at Dawn and Arizona's Deadliest Gunfight. I had never heard about that. That completely blew me away.
Yeah, somewhere I had come across this story about the shootout at Power's cabin in 1918,
Yeah.
and it's a really interesting story. And of course, I've taken the setting and I've taken the storyline and I've advanced it into the near future. But the parallels from now and back to 1918 are still important to think about. The shootout that happened there, you had some overreaching government officials who pushed it pretty far. You had the powers may have probably been shady characters,
Yeah.
but they just kind of wanted to be left alone. And because of government intrusion, people were dead. And it launched the largest manhunt in Arizona history. And so you had all these military troops who were brought in to pursue the Powers sons, Tom and John, as they ran across the Arizona and Mexico desert for the next, I think it was a month or two that they were on the run. And the military brought in aircraft and tanks and all kinds of technology to pursue them at that time. It's an interesting story, and I would recommend those books. I have not read either one of those books, but what I've reviewed or what I've found on them in the reviews were enough to make me put them up there and mention them. I didn't want to be an expert on the Powers Booth shootout. I wanted Potter's Run to be its own story, and it was inspired by that in the sense that it was a man who said no, and he specifically said he didn't want his kids dying in a rich man's war.
Yeah.
And so that struck a chord. And then the fact that the kids were able to go out against some of the most advanced technology of the time and hold their own for a good time. And when they were captured, they ultimately surrendered because they said they didn't want to kill any American soldiers, and that was what they were finally stopped by, was a column of U.S. soldiers.
Yeah, that's interesting. And I actually completely understand when you said you didn't want to read the books because sometimes I've had it with music or writing, things like that, where if there's something that could be close enough that it could bleed into it, you know what I mean? I try to stay away from
Yeah.
it too. So I actually, that does make sense to me. And I think, I had interviewed Scott Horton on here and he had recommended a book that I bought, or maybe I had it before him. I can't remember, but this book, Wilson's War, and it's how Woodrow Wilson's great blunder led to Hitler, Lenin, Stalin, and World War II.
Oh,
And so
wow.
one, there's another book that I have not read called what is it? Churchill, Hitler, and the Unforgettable, or in the oh, I'm blanking on the name, in the basically the war that didn't need to happen, the avoidable war, something like that.
Mhm.
But anyway, I'll link it below. But um, the idea being that World War II was really a failure in diplomacy. It wasn't just that Hitler said, "I'm going to conquer the world," which is pretty much what we're taught in school.
Right.
And I see it happening right now with Putin. I find Russia to be, besides America, probably the most fascinating. Not that I think that they're good or whatever, but just fascinating. Putin's a fascinating character, kind of
Yeah.
Machiavellian in a lot of ways. He's interesting to read about. Russia's just an interesting country to read about. But I feel like if you've bought into this lie that Putin is somehow going to conquer Europe when he's barely conquered, a mile of Ukraine.
Right.
Don't buy into that. That's a scare tactic. And so it's interesting to really go. Point of all this is, as I've gone back and looked at World War One, World War Two, Korea, Vietnam, you start to see like people got drafted for these bullshit wars.
Right.
And even in that movie Legends of the Fall, I just watched that recently, where Brad Pitt's character's dad, Anthony Hopkins, is saying like, "You boys have never even left this state. What are you talking about going over there to fight? You have no idea what war's like." So then you start to realize, like, growing up, you're always told that draft dodgers are cowards and all these things, but
Right.
it's,
Right.
look at what World War, or look at what Vietnam like brought out. Like my great uncle died in Vietnam, and it's like, was
Right.
that pointless? It kind of feels like it. And I'll never cry over a dead communist. I mean, hey, it's cool, I guess, that we
Right.
took out some of them, but
Yeah.
um but man, so then I started thinking through, okay, well, should we start saying no to these drafts? And before I go any farther, I'll let you kind of hop in if you have anything you want to say.
Well, so I held the same kind of views growing up, and that draft dodgers were just terrible. I mean, what were they thinking?
Yeah,
Everybody had to go do their part, and if communism succeeded in Vietnam, then it was going to move to the whole domino effect and everything.
yeah,
I bought into all that stuff, and then I remember having a conversation with my grandfather, and I was at a very young age really interested in history and World War II.
yeah,
And this was back when there were still a lot of World War II veterans alive, including my grandfather. And I was out in his shop and I said something to the effect of, "When did you enlist, Grandpa?" Meaning, when did you go down and sign on the dotted line because you want to go do your part in the war? And he just kind of smiled and smirked at me. He said, "I didn't enlist. They drafted me."
yeah,
And I remember, I don't know how old I was, but a little piece of me was kind of crushed because it was like, but that was World War II. Everybody wanted to go do that. That was the good war.
yeah,
And why would Grandpa not want to go do that? And of course, I was younger and I hadn't seen a lot of things at that point. Now, after having spent time in places like Iraq and Afghanistan, I have a better understanding for why it took a draft to get Grandpa into World War II. And I
yeah,
don't begrudge him, and I don't begrudge the people who went to Canada instead of fought in Vietnam anymore. I used to,
yeah,
but but I look at all that a little bit differently now, and most of that is because uh, it's really at the feet of the political and military leaders that we have, especially today. I don't trust any of them, and I don't trust the direction they're taking us or the stories they're telling us. And so, are any of those things worth dying for? I don't think so. They're going to have to do some big convincing, and that was another thing that I tried to bring out in the book was we're all really isolated despite the internet. I mean, there's so much information that can be obtained on the internet that there's too much information and there's so much disinformation and misinformation. It's hard to sort through. So who do you trust and who do you believe? Um, it's, my circle of trust has shrunk to almost nothing
yeah.
unless it's somebody that I know really closely and I know where they're getting their information from. And so in the book, the characters are all extremely isolated. And in the subsequent books, it gets even more and more isolated as the county is specifically cut off and isolated. So,
Wow. Yeah, that's interesting. Clay Martin, who's a friend of the show, I've talked to him about this a bit before because talking about a World War III, and it's like there are some of the people who are, we'll call the elites, whether they're elected officials, billionaires, whatever. Some of them do have views of that there's too many people on this earth and that they need
right.
to get rid of them. Well, what better way to do that than have a mass casualty world war where you can draft everybody out of the red states, have all of your political opponents and their kids get killed, and then fill them up with people who are going to be more inclined to vote your way? That's a scary thought. Now, I actually, speaking of Clay, I just listened to an interview he did on another podcast today where he pointed out, and I actually kind of agree with him. I don't really know if people my age or anybody younger, like, if we're really feeling like we're gonna go to war for anything. And what I mean by that is after 9/11, they say people were lining up to go over. I think that now people have started to become so skeptical of things that if there is any mass casualty thing, I don't think it's going to move people the way it used to. I think people are going to start with, conspiracies. I mean, we don't even can't agree on what happened to JFK. We can't agree on if the moon happened. We saw the way that Vietnam ended. We sure as hell saw what happened in the pullout of Afghanistan. So it just feels like all these people who fought and died, that it was pointless. Now, I don't think it was. I really actually don't believe that it was pointless, but I understand how people could feel that way. So it's like, yeah, if you think that I'm gonna go, or that I want my family members who are in the military to go die overseas, for countries that I've never been in and I can't even completely believe are our allies or whatever, like, you're crazy. I don't want that. And I think that a lot of people are just, instead of being like, oh, this is crazy that this happened, we need to fight back, I think that the conspiracies are just are
Yeah.
gonna start, people won't buy
Yeah.
into it.
Yeah. And one thing I want to say is we should remember that a lot of those guys who like stormed the beaches of Normandy and liberated concentration camps, and guys who were prepared to storm the beaches of Japan, they were conscripted and they were
Yeah.
drafted and they went anyway. They didn't want to be there. They didn't want to do what they had to do or see what they had
Yeah.
to see and be a part of any of that, but they did it anyway. And they felt it was their duty. And was it something worthy, and was it necessary? I think so. And
Yeah.
I honor those guys as much as I honor the guys who volunteered and lined up and lied about their age to get there. And there may come a time where we need a draft, but we've had a draft. And this past 50 years without a draft is really kind of the aberration in our history. We've had a draft since the Revolutionary War in one form or another. So
Yeah.
I'm not necessarily entirely opposed to the notion, but we need to revamp how we do it, and
Yeah.
most certainly why we do it. And we need to hold the politicians accountable when we do it. And
Yeah.
we're not holding politicians accountable anymore. We see an R or a D next to their name and we vote for them because we think they're on our side. None of
Yeah.
them are on our side. So that's one
Yeah.
thing I think we need to
I
wake up
completely
to.
agree. I think that there needs to be a law where either the politician or somebody in their direct family, whether it be a son or a grandson, has to fight in some capacity. You know what I mean? In any
Yeah,
war
yeah,
like that, that should be that really should be it, because it's easy to just to send people over. And I agree with what you're saying. It's like after Pearl Harbor, yeah, it's a no brainer to fight Japan. Killing Nazis, no brainer. Get that, do that. Uh, Even in the some of the Viet Cong, like I said, I hate communism, so I totally understand wanting to push back against
right.
it. The way that it ended sucks, but I also think that there's a lot more there in Vietnam than we were being told, in Korea than we were being told, even in World War II. I think it started off as a failure of diplomacy, where it was probably avoidable, and then it turned into an unavoidable and necessary thing that we do get into.
Yeah.
But I don't think it had to be that way either.
Right.
Same
And
thing with. Go ahead.
yeah,
Go
well,
ahead.
I'm kind of researching I've just finished a new rough manuscript. So it takes place in the mid 1930s.
Yeah.
And so you're seeing all of the events starting to snowball into an unavoidable war. And
Yeah.
and I started writing that book because I needed a break from Potter's Run and Potter's Stand and Potter's War. I needed
Yeah.
to get away from the news for a while and just go back and write something fun and escape from the current events. But I couldn't, because everything that was happening in 1935 leading to unavoidable war seems to be what we're looking at now. And it's our political leaders who are failing us, who are putting us on that road to war.
Yeah.
And what you're saying about having, the politicians' kids, absolutely. There needs to be more skin in the game. And that's why in the book, um, in Potter's Run, we have the introduction of women being drafted, which sparks this guy to try to prevent his daughter from being drafted in World War III.
Yeah.
In a time when there is total equality and we're all the same, maybe everybody needs to be eligible for the draft, and maybe that's something that needs to be changed. And maybe if we get enough skin in the game, maybe people will sit back and say, wait a minute, if my daughter's got to go over there, maybe we shouldn't be doing this. Or maybe if this transgender kid has to go, maybe this isn't something that we should be doing.
Exactly.
Um, So, and that's interesting because like right now, there's women are not expected there. But I wrote this down so I wouldn't get it wrong right from the selective service page. Um, so, well, one thing, immigrants, whether they're documented or undocumented, are required to sign up for selective service. So you've got these millions of people pouring across the border
Yeah.
illegally to begin with. Do they really expect them to be going to selective service and signing up? I don't know.
Yeah.
But the other thing is you've got women being ineligible for selective service in the draft. And then that now we have the question of transgenders. And this is right from the selective service page. U.S. citizens or immigrants who are assigned male at birth and change their gender to female are still required to register. Individuals who are assigned female at birth and change their gender to male are not required to register.
Wow.
So
How
that,
transphobic.
yeah, right. I mean, that's, you can't really have it both ways, can you?
No.
Well, I guess you can in this day and age, but
Yeah.
you shouldn't
Yeah.
be able to. If we actually have equality and everybody's the same, everybody should be getting skin in this game and everybody should be eligible for the draft.
Yeah. And the sad part is like, that that's not what it'll be. Like I said, it's going
Right.
to be white dudes from red states. I mean, I remember after, I think it was when Israel got attacked and they started putting white guys on military ads again, and
Yeah.
people were like, "Oh shit, we're going to war." and
Yeah.
yeah, because that's how it's going to be. And I love like some of my favorite things to read about are our military history. Like I love reading about Vietnam and the GWAT. I'm so fascinated by it.
Mhm.
The world wars, all of those things. But again, the boots on the ground stories are different than the diplomacy stories and
Yeah.
what the
Yeah.
generals and the people of, the politicians were doing. That's where my criticism is. The guys on the ground are heroes and awesome Americans and fascinating. You know what I mean? So that's never the issue. It's the issue of the guys, the people who have the responsibility of, it's like you got these war fighters. I got friends who are war fighters that are still active duty that are like, I will go to war with Russia right now. I don't even care what the ground, like one of my friends is like, I would love to fight Russians. Doesn't even care why, right? He's just an American, been in the army for years, wants to fight. You have to be responsible with guys like that. You know what I mean?
Right.
Because
Right.
their life matters. Every life matters, but it's like you have to be there's just so much responsibility with war fighters. You shouldn't just be sending them out there like like a mobster taking a hit on somebody who
Right.
pissed them off, which is how we've used the CIA and other agencies for for a
Yeah.
long time. And so that's where the criticism and concern is. And as I was saying earlier, it's like we saw how Vietnam ended, we saw how Afghanistan ended. Why the hell? I mean, you see Europe right now, it's being invaded, so it's like but they're letting it happen to themselves. And it's like, you think I'm going to fight for any of it? No, absolutely not. I
Right.
don't want any of my I don't even want any of my family or friends in the military, quite honestly. You know what I
Yeah.
mean? It's just not the same. And I've watched this with um a lot of the military guys I follow on Twitter, like guys who have actually killed people, been shot, been blown up, have really been there, and they'll do polls and be like, would you let your kids to join the military? And they all say no. Would you let your
Right.
kids to go fight in a war? They all say no. These are guys that
Right.
have been there and done it, and they're saying no, I don't want my kids to fight. Which is kind
Right.
of which is basically what your book is about. And that's really interesting, and it should make all of us kind of pause and think, what, why is that,
Right. Right. And yeah, you know, seeing that develop out of people and the family lineages suddenly stopping in the military because I mean, we're not even controlling our border right now.
Yeah.
If we don't have a border, we don't have a country. What is the point of fighting for something that we're not defining as a country anymore?
Yeah.
Then we're back to dying for a rich man's war, aren't we? The
Yeah.
same thing that they were talking about in 1918 that started the Powers Cabin shootout. So here we are back doing the same thing again, and everybody's going to fall for it. and half the people in the country are doing it because, well, this war must be cool because this is the guy I voted for. And instead of saying, oh no, wait a second, we don't want this war, you know,
Yeah.
regardless of who's president. But everybody's been divided, Republican and Democrat, and pitted against each other. And people are just falling for it instead of thinking for themselves.
Yeah. Well, that's I listen to I like Jesse Kelly. I listen to him a lot. And
Yeah,
you know who he is?
I
I was
do. And
actually
I was just, listening to him today, actually, with Tucker Carlson. And
yeah, yeah.
I appreciate his stance that he considers himself an anti-communist rather than a Republican. I've never been a Republican. I've always been non-affiliated. I've always
Yeah.
voted that way, but I've never, and very recently, I've realized that the Republicans are not doing us any favors, and they're not really any different than the Democrats are anyway. So here
Yeah.
we are.
Yeah, no kidding. I Jesse actually interviewed me back in November for I had just written this book, How to Win Your Local Election.
Oh,
Because I should send you a copy.
yeah,
But I like yeah, what he says about just, being an anti-communist and stuff, but he always points out how the races that are more important than the president, it's like your DA, your sheriff, your school boards, those are important.
right.
And I think with what you're talking about with the military lineages stopping, it's like, yeah, a lot of these guys are probably going to go to sheriff's departments. Like that's where I really look at people who I have a lot of hope in, because if you
Yeah,
get a good sheriff in, that's you're in a pretty good county. I think my sheriff is a good guy. One of my best friends just got sworn in as a deputy, and that's cool to see. I think that, you know I always felt guilty for not joining the military, but I can at least say, hey, I was on a volunteer fire department for a few years.
yeah,
I ran for city council. I was on city council. I've helped out doing other things in my community, right? So I
right.
still serve, not in the capacity of the military, but served in other places. And so I think that that's probably what a lot of people are going to do, is start turning that direction. Like I said, the volunteer fire department, the fire department, the deputies, things like that, which is a good thing. But then again, I see guys like Eddie Gallagher who got royally screwed by the military complex, and his son's going to the Marines, and Eddie's like, well, I don't like cancel culture, and just because something bad happened to me doesn't mean I'm, not going to let
Yeah,
my son join. And it's like,
yeah,
dang, man, like I wouldn't let my kids join because of what
yeah,
happened to you. I can't imagine him going through it and still being like,
yeah,
oh well. So yeah,
yeah.
it's interesting.
And and speaking of the sheriffs, I interviewed Sheriff Daryl Wheeler in Bonner County, Idaho.
Oh wow.
He for the For Potter's Run,
Yeah,
and had him read an initial copy of it to help me out with procedural things
that's cool.
and anything he saw. And it was really interesting conversations I've had with him. And he's what is considered a constitutional sheriff. And I started doing some research into this constitutional sheriff concept, which I thought was odd because shouldn't all sheriffs be constitutional?
Yeah, no kidding.
But but apparently there are a lot of people who do not believe that we should have constitutional sheriffs, and there's a big controversy surrounding it.
Yeah,
Sheriff Wheeler is an ardent supporter of the entire Constitution, and he is a firm believer that he stands as kind of the final line against government abuse of the citizens of Bonner County. And we do have these constitutional sheriffs throughout the country, and they do see themselves in that role, and they do periodically stand up against state and federal government entities that are coming against their citizens. So
yeah,
we need to really support those guys and be there for them as much as they're there for us. Because one of the things we're seeing right now is, we talked about that end of the military lineage. It's because of a lack of faith in the government. It's a breakdown of the social contract, and the government in this country is supposed to be there to protect us, and it's supposed to be there to support us. We're not supposed to be there to be slaves to the government. We're not, it's not supposed to be some feudal setup where we have our rulers above and we, you know, bow down to them. We do whatever
Yeah.
they need of us.
Yeah.
We're forgetting that. And this breakdown in the social contract is making the divisions wider and wider. And they're getting more desperate and they're going to be more likely to use force and jail against people who speak up against it.
Yeah. So are you saying that when Hakeem Jeffries tweeted today and said House Democrats will continue to deliver real results for the American people and the free world, that why is he throwing in the world in that when he should really just focus on the American part?
Well,
Are you
and
saying
you
that
know,
that's fishy?
yeah, I don't, man. I just, yeah, I've kind of, I've got this concept of, you know, being a pilot, I guess, that the airline principle, where, um, you know, they say in the passenger briefing, in the event, unlikely event of a cabin depressurization, be sure to put your own mask on before you help anyone else with their mask.
Yeah.
Well, we've had an explosive decompression in this country, and we need to put our own freaking mask on before we can help anybody else in the world. Right now is the time for us to kind of, I'm not saying we need to isolate, but we need to hunker down, get our own issues fixed before we can help Israel and Ukraine and Taiwan. I mean, Taiwan's going to be a big hit. That's going to be a really bad problem. China's going to move on Taiwan
Yeah.
probably sooner than anybody thinks because they know they can. They are in a politically, um, an environment politically where they know they can get away with it.
Yeah.
So, um, and that's going to that's going to be the war that we're going to have to get involved in. And it's the war that we could prevent right now if we had control of our own issues first.
Yeah.
But because we don't have that foundation, because we don't have that oxygen mask on right now, we can't help anybody else.
That's perfect because that leads into what I want to talk about next. Charles, are we going into World War III?
Oh, that's kind of above my pay grade. I'm just a guy who flies airplanes and writes a couple of books now and then. But and I hope we're not, but it's kind of looking that way, isn't it? I mean, and you know, it wasn't this way a few years ago, but we've got wars in Ukraine. We've got an upcoming war between Israel and Iran and the whole Hamas mess.
Yeah.
Um, we've got Taiwan, like we were saying, Taiwan is teetering under, you know, potential invasion by China, and they're just waiting to develop the logistics they need to get across that strait, and they're
Yeah.
going to take it back. So yeah, I think we are stumbling towards World War III, unfortunately, and maybe not, and maybe war looks different now.
Yeah.
Maybe what we've just seen between Iran and Israel, maybe that's the way it's going to go. Is people are going to lob a few missiles at each other to prove their point and chest and thump their chest, and everybody, you know, maybe that'll be enough. But I also think that there's going to be a point where all that technology, well, technology always fails at some
Yeah.
point, and typically at a critical juncture. But at some point, there's going to be a guy with a rifle who's going to have to occupy some space somewhere, and it's going to happen. You know, all the missiles, all the defenses, all the electronic warfare and countermeasures and countermeasures ultimately lead to putting guys on the ground somewhere, and that's just like I said in doing research in the 1930s of how looking at it from the outside and looking at it from the future, yeah, it was like, oh, they could have stopped it here. It was this chain of events that
Yeah.
somewhere along the way it could have been stopped, but it wasn't, and nobody's stopping it now. So yeah, I'm afraid it's going to happen when it's most politically conducive to somebody's career, I'm sure. So
Yeah. Yeah. That's interesting. And it made me wonder too. I wonder what would happen in a city if or in a town, village, whatever, if there was a draft, if people in the town, and it doesn't even have to be everybody, it could be 30% of the people all wrote a letter saying we're not going, our kids aren't going, send it to the sheriff and say, you know, you're either going to defend us or we're going to vote your ass out of here. So you pick. and
Yeah.
then letting the sheriff say, hey, I'm not going to enforce anybody who's refusing to go. And if you got issues with it, then we're just going to have to deal with it however you want to deal with it. That's kind of interesting. As somebody, I don't know if it's from growing up doing martial arts, if it's from loving the movie Red Dawn and always, with my friends since high school, just saying like, what would we do if, what would you do if, and just living in that what would I do if world for almost my entire life. But as somebody who's thought this through and overthought this and talks to different people and talks to people who have been in special forces and all this stuff, the conspiracy side of me would say, hey, if these people really believe in limiting population, if they really hate their political opponents as much as they obviously do, what better way to get us all killed than a world war? Like that side of me does think of that. The other side of me, I don't know if this is practical or impractical, but then the other side of me just says, man, I think everybody's just so they don't have the guts in a lot of ways that they used to, and they're so afraid. Politicians are so afraid of their polls and things like that that it seems like Joe Biden just wants everybody to stop. Like he can't. He just wants nothing to happen. And for everything to chill out. And when you look at things practically speaking, some of the things that kind of make me feel safe is I've just by the way people have answered or not answered questions, it kind of seems like America has some sort of an iron dome of itself. So I don't really worry about anything coming into America and touching us because I think that there's so many ways that we could stop it. But at least right now, 20 years from now, if we keep going down this road of breaking and ruining everything we have, it's not going to be that way. But for now, I feel somewhat safe. And then you also have to think like Eric Prince is somebody that the for people who don't know who he was like the founder of Blackwater. He's somebody who, if he does an interview, I'll pretty much stop anything I'm doing to listen to him talk because he's very interesting. And he pointed out there's so much stuff with Taiwan that, as far as like practically what China has to do to physically invade there, that it's not necessarily like an easy task. And so I don't know if we can kind of keep slow rolling that, and eventually, if we can get some different leadership in who can make it clear to China that they're not going to deal with it, we may be in a better spot. So nobody's going to be able to predict this perfectly, you know what I mean? So on
Yeah.
one hand, that's the conspiracy side of me, what I would think. The other side of me just thinks I think everybody's going to try to slow roll it and de-escalate it because they're too afraid of actually doing that.
Yeah. Well, and that's certainly true. Taiwan's not going to be easy for
Yeah,
China to take unless they take it from within, which is also a possibility and something they
that's a good
do
point.
try to
Yeah,
do.
yeah,
But they don't necessarily. It's not necessarily something that they are going to win, but it may be something that they think they're going to win and they still start anyway. And if they are operating in a politically permissive environment, well, that's one big obstacle that's out of their way. So yeah, I don't think an invasion of Taiwan is necessarily a sure thing for China because it is full of obstacles. Taiwan, unless they are undermined politically and their military and intelligence infrastructure is undermined, well, they could put up a heck of a fight. And China may be, in fact, I wrote another book series that covers some of this stuff, but China may be a paper dragon after all. But that doesn't mean they're not going to start a war, and that doesn't mean that a lot of people are going to die to find that out. So
yeah. China's one where I'm almost dual minded on that because the obvious take on it is that they're a threat, they're a danger, they're all of these things. But then I also hear again from people like Scott Horton, where they're basically saying, like, hey, China's not as much of a threat as you people think so. And what they're trying to do is scare us the way that they scared us with Saddam Hussein for years. And
mhm.
so you really have to, man, it's just a confusing world, man, because you never, like I said, this is the problem is that we've seen so many things happen, 9/11, all these different conspiracy theories that now if
Yeah,
something big happens, it's not going to be like, oh, this pisses me off, I'm ready to fight. It's going to be like,
yeah,
so did Dick Cheney do that? You know what I mean?
yeah,
Like there are
yeah,
people going to be asking more questions.
yeah. And is that itself part of a giant conspiracy, like a poisoning of the well, where
Yeah.
everybody's so demoralized because they don't know what to believe and they don't know what's true, that they're just not going to fight for anything, and they get invaded silently across their borders and get infiltrated by all kinds of people, and sold out by their politicians, and people just sit back and take it. So
Yeah.
that's my biggest fear, really. And
Yeah.
and we kind of
Go ahead.
well, we kind of saw that with the whole COVID thing
Yeah.
and the vaccination. I lost a job of nearly 13 years because I wouldn't take the shot.
Oh, wow.
And it was a decent sized company. There were several hundred of us who deployed overseas between air crew, pilots, and maintenance workers. But there were only maybe a dozen or so of us who said no to the shot. And so, people had their price, and it was their paycheck. And I understand, that shot was a good choice for some people because they had other issues, and it was a gamble, as to what was going on. So I understood that, but it wasn't a good choice for me, and it wasn't
Yeah.
a good choice for my kids, and we weren't going to do it. And I saw going through that the pressure that was put on us. And I spent a year and a half between without a decent paycheck or without a regular paycheck, because I was out of work as a result of those policies. And that's when I wrote Potter's Run, actually, and that probably had a big influence also on the
Yeah.
book, because it's not just about the draft; it's about saying no to government tyranny.
Yeah.
And that can come in a lot of forms and a lot of shapes. And what we saw was not many people said no, and those of us who did say no didn't have a lot of support. So
Yeah.
you were kind of alone in the wilderness, and that's another theme to the book, obviously, is being alone in the wilderness. So
Yeah, that's definitely scary to see that, and it makes you wonder too, will people do that again? I had a cop, I think he's either from St. Louis or Kansas City. He was on one of those two departments, and he basically told me, he's like, "Hey, you know what? A lot of departments were kind of caught flat-footed with 2020 riots. They didn't expect it. They weren't prepared for it." And he said, "We're prepared now, and we're not going to let it happen." And that's going to depend on where you live, quite honestly. If you live in a blue area, like, your stuff's going to get broke. But if you live in maybe more of a red area, like we were talking about earlier, with the DA or sheriff is going to back them, we may see more police push back and not allow all this rioting and stuff to happen. Could be the same if they tried another lockdown. It seems like every time that they're like, "There's a new strain of COVID, there's a new strain of
yeah,
monkeypox," everybody's like, "Yeah,
yeah,
whatever, not dealing
yeah,
with it." So,
yeah,
um, that's interesting, and we'll see how that happens. I wanted to say too, when you're talking about all these conspiracy theories, could be a conspiracy theory. The interview, if anybody wants to listen to it, that my friend Clay was on, was Coffee and a Mic, and it just came out a couple days ago. But he made the most insane case of how Donald Trump could be a psyop. That it's like, damn, man, you got me convinced. Kind of. It's like he was basically just saying, wouldn't Trump be smart enough to kick out the deep state? Like, how could he have not seen that coming? You know what I mean? Like, it just seems so obvious. And it's like, well, people can get swayed and tricked and things like that. But the idea of that is interesting in and of itself. And I don't know. One of my sayings is, I'll just say, I'll wait till the book comes out. And what I mean by that is, if there's something crazy that happens, it's like, all right, I'm gonna withhold judgment until someone has
right,
written a book about it in a couple of
yeah,
years. Because I started thinking that way. I had read Dave Cullen's book on Columbine, and finding that so much of what I thought I knew about Columbine was totally off. So many stories got mixed up. He really broke down, uh, Dylan and Eric's personalities, and you start to see how this all unfolded. And it's like, wow, this is not what I remember at all. And it's kind of
um,
just changed my mentality of like, I'm going to wait for the book to come out. And it's like, when Russia invaded Ukraine, man, I went to the library and I'm like, oh, I better get all the books I can on Russia. Or when the Taliban took over Afghanistan and that pullout, I'm like, I got to go to the library and get the Taliban books before anybody else does. And lo and
right,
behold, there was not a line for the Russian books. There was not a
yeah,
line for the Taliban books.
yeah,
So I got them and I read what I could, and it helped me put everything in a perspective. And it's like, okay, based off of the past, this may be
yeah,
what's happening in the future. And I'm glad I did that, because with Russia, like, it doesn't really freak me out. after I've started to understand the country and understand Putin. I guess what I get more pissed off about is people who don't know what they're talking about saying like wanting to get rid of Putin or whatever. And it's like, man, you could get somebody way worse in there.
Yeah.
You have no idea.
Right.
So it's crazy stuff. Well, I want to ask you, you being a pilot. So I haven't flown since I was like 6 or 7 years old, and a couple weeks ago I flew out to Dallas I was interviewed at the Blaze Studios there, and
Cool.
I was absolutely terrified, totally terrified driving to the airport. Usually I can logically think my way through something, and I was sitting there and I'm thinking, just driving to the airport is so much more dangerous than flying.
Yeah.
Driving to Texas from Nebraska is, just an incalculable amount more dangerous than flying is. Flying right now, it might even be the safest thing I could be doing in the world. Yet I was terrified. And then when the plane starts and it started moving, I was sitting at the very back of the plane, and I had this lady who sat next to me, and her husband was a doctor, and I think she flies pretty often. And she's like, "Oh, I always buy the seat in the very back of the plane. I like this more." And the plane starts, and I'm like, I lean over and I'm like, "I am absolutely terrified right now." And she's like, "Really?" And I'm like, "Yes, I'm really scared." And she's like, "Look out the window. It's beautiful." And I start to turn my head, and my peripheral hit the window, and I almost passed out. Like I couldn't handle it. So I just leaned over and I was talking to her the whole flight. She was probably like, thought it was kind of weird because like I'm like, every time it like would bounce or something, I would just, "Hey, so what do you think?" I mean, I was talking to her about politics, anything I could to get my mind off of the
Yeah.
flight. And I was like, "Is it always this loud?" And she's like, "Well, usually it's louder." And she's like, this has been a very nice flight." And I'm thinking like, what? I'm like, dude, if we hit any turbulence, I'm gonna have a heart attack. So then on the flight back, I first of all, I was just trying to not even think about having to fly back because I was so nervous. So on the fly back, I'm sitting there in my chair and I'm praying for like a half hour, and I can feel the plane moving and I can feel us rising, and I'm like, okay, well, I'm in the air now. And after a while, I start to feel peace. I'm like, all right, thanks, God. And I look out my window and I see the wing, and it's kind of all green underneath, and I'm like, oh, it's beautiful up here. And then I look out the window and I'm like, wait, we're still on the runway. And I'm like, dude. So then when we actually did take off, again, I was out of my mind with fear. And so I was just kind of praying, trying to pray through it. And about halfway through the flight, I just kind of felt peace. I started looking out the window. I watched us fly into Omaha. I was looking out the window. I'm like, this is pretty cool. We landed. I watched us land, and I had a lot more peace about it. So um, I'm nervous about having to fly again. Dallas is, and keep in mind, this flight is like an hour long. Like we basically go up in the air, and then they're like,
Yeah.
now we're landing. So what could you tell me to make me feel better about flying, especially flying commercial?
Well, especially for a short flight like that, my recommendation would be to drive.
Oh yeah.
Just drive. Yeah.
Well,
Between the time,
that's a 14-hour drive though.
oh, really? Okay. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
But I like a road trip too. So,
Well,
but
so
no,
to go
as,
from
as a pilot, being up front is a whole lot different than being in back and having to deal with, TSA and the airport crowds and the crush of people. Man, I'd rather drive any day.
Oh, really? But that's just more so because you don't like you just find it to be a pain in the ass to fly.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
So how about but flying though? Let's talk about the safety of it so I can feel better. I mean, the way that I think about it is, especially flying commercial and something like that. I mean, it's pretty safe, right? I mean, it's not like
Yeah.
you never hear stories of an actual plane crash. Overseas you hear crazy stories, but I just thought, man, from flying from Nebraska to Texas, it's an hour flight versus, what's realistically probably a 15-hour drive.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? And so it's I don't really mind the TSA and the crowd thing didn't really bother me as much. The Dallas airport was insane though. That's kind of
Yeah.
stressful to navigate, but yeah, I mean, I get, I've heard stories like my brothers talked about how they hit turbulence once flying, I think Mexico, where he said they were dropping altitude so hard that it was like it felt like 100 feet or 50, however much
Yeah.
it was a lot. So, what do you? I don't know. What else can you tell me though to ease my thoughts on flying commercial?
Um, yeah. Well, it is super safe. And if you go on any of these ADSB trackers, and
Yeah.
just look at the thousands of flights that are over the United States every day.
Yeah.
It really is a safe endeavor, and it's not what it used to be, and it's generally trending to get safer and safer every year. And unless of course, and we may be seeing that, is this whole competency crisis starts
Yeah. The
catching up
PEI
with the
thing. Oh yeah.
airline. Yeah.
Yeah.
So, um, but but overall, right now, you're going to be fine flying on your next trip.
Well,
So
haven't most of the kind of a lot of the commercial flights that have had issues, I mean, that's we're talking like 60s and 70s, aren't we? Where
yeah,
they've been
yeah, and there were
because
fairly big crashes in the 80s too, and a lot of that stuff has been corrected through some better rules and a lot of better technology. So, um,
now what about as a well, by the way, too, even if you have an engine go out, I mean, they're dual engine, aren't they? So like even
oh
have
yeah,
something happen
yep,
to the engine's not so now what about this? Because this is one thing that I was freaked out on because I flew out the day that that Baltimore Bridge thing happened. And
oh
that
yeah,
morning, I watched the video of the ship, like the lights go out, and then it crashed into the barricade, and people were saying it
yeah.
got hacked. And I was like, oh no, oh no, I did not need to see this. So, as a pilot and as a commercial pilot, is it? I know that people say that this is possible, but you tell me, would it really be possible for the pilots to be in the cockpit, for the plane to get hacked, and then for somebody to just crash the plane? Is that within the realm of possibility?
I, I've never flown airline aircraft. I've flown a few jets, but never any of the big airline aircraft, and I'm not familiar enough with their systems. I've never flown anything personally that could get
Yeah,
hacked like that. There's always a way to disable the autopilot and just manually fly it. And I'm sure that's also true with the big airline stuff. Um, but I yeah, I don't think that's possible. But I'm not familiar enough to say 100% that they can't do that.
so yeah, I mean, even if somebody was able to turn off the autopilot, the pilots still have to be competent. And I mean, for one,
Yeah,
once you're in the air, my understanding is you're kind of just sitting there, like it's kind of does. That's the easy part. It's the
yeah,
my one friend told me statistically, your highest chances of an issue are within 5 minutes of takeoff and 5 minutes of landing.
yeah.
So he said if you're gonna get nervous, just be nervous at those times. Uh, so, which I'm like, okay, I can handle that. 10 minutes of nervousness is better than an hour and a half of it. But
Yeah,
so theoretically, if somebody was able to turn off the autopilot, the pilot should still be able to manually control it from the cockpit,
yeah,
right? Yeah.
yep, yep.
See, I wish I would have known this beforehand because I was like, dude, what if we do get hacked by the Russians or something, over there. So, do you think when people have a fear of flying like how I do you think that that's kind of funny, or do you get it? I mean,
No, no. I mean, no. Everybody's got their fears, right? So,
yeah,
you know, I, w- I like to have fun with it, but I don't think it's necessarily funny. You know what I
yeah,
mean? I think I like to try to I like to try to just work through stress through with humor, my
yeah, of
own
course.
stress, and try to help other people with humor. So I don't think it's funny in that sense, but I do like to have fun with it to try to help them through it. So it's nothing for you to worry about, and I would just try to sit back, relax, and enjoy the view.
Yeah. Yeah, that's interesting. I've got a friend with autism, and I was asking my other mutual friend, I'm like, how does he fly? Because like airports and airplanes and stuff are so loud, and I thought that that was kind of a trigger for autistic people, and this guy has to fly all the time, and I was like, I don't know how he does it, because I would think that that was, and I'm curious, and I'm not even making a joke about it. I am curious to ask, people with autism who fly a lot, like, doesn't the noise and all that bother you? Because I mean, I don't have autism as far as I know, but it's sure triggering to me. So
I don't know.
that's interesting. Well, before I let you go on this, I know that you brought some props. Did you want to discuss them at all, or no need, or
Well,
what?
I just because of that class, that public speaking class, they just told me to use props, but that class was a long time ago, and I don't really even know. I'm not sure what to do with these now, but I
What
brought them just in case. So
are those actual propellers or the?
so I the one has a clock in it. I'm not sure the story on that. This one was custom made by an airboat manufacturer. My brother made me um, a little Fokker triplane bassinet,
Yeah.
and he got and it looks just like the Red Baron's Fokker triplane, and he had these folks make this propeller for it. So,
That's cool. Were you into planes as a kid? Or have you always been fascinated by
oh yeah,
planes?
and yeah, since I was 5 years old, I wanted to be a pilot. So,
Yeah, even honestly, even some of this Boeing stuff doesn't necessarily freak me out. Although it seems like everybody else is freaked out by it. What do you have any hot takes on that or not really?
um, uh, just the concern that it's an indicator of a growing competency crisis, and that
Yeah.
maybe maybe we've peaked in terms of safety and efficiency, and
Yeah.
maybe we're edging closer towards the whole world of idiocracy, because it's easy to look at the world right now and be afraid that's where we're headed.
Yeah, no kidding. And like I said, that's the thing that concerns me because right now we are pretty safe, in America. Like I really don't worry about nukes. I don't. Now, trust me, I've thought through and I guess have a plan of if something like that happened, but I don't. That doesn't really freak me out at all. I don't find it to be that practical. But like I said, though, in 20 years from now, these things could start to be more of a concern, and I am concerned about the flying aspect of the if you're lowering standards for pilots, if you're lowering standards for flight control like that, don't look. Wait, are you serious? You know
Yeah,
what I mean? I
right.
cannot believe that we would even entertain the idea of lowering standards for anything. You know what I mean? Doctors, military, whatever. But the pilot thing is kind of bananas. I guess the only thing that's made me feel better is it's like, well, man, the planes kind of basically fly themselves, but then I get again freaked out of like, okay, but then that means that they can be hacked. And then it's like, damn it, now I'm scared again. So yeah. Well that's cool. Well, like I told everybody, man, your book Potter's Run turned into a series. Highly recommended if you're somebody who's, probably like-minded and has thought through some of these questions. It's a nice window into what could potentially happen. Somewhat similar to Clay Martin's books like Wrath of the Wendigo. There's another book, War of the Dog. Just kind of a glimpse into what could happen in the near future. Is it possible? Hopefully not. But or is it practical? Hopefully not. But it's possible, I guess. So, Charles, I appreciate you coming on the show, and I appreciate you writing the book.
Great. Thanks a lot. Appreciate your
Yeah.
having me.
Again, thank you, Charles, for coming on the show. I really had a great time. And for everybody listening, Charles is a really good guy. I just like him as a person. I like his books. And I had a lot of fun talking to him. I might talk to him again more on Book Brilliant, or I'll have him on my other podcast, Tool Shed Art Club. So please check that out as well. And I will see you whenever I decide to do another episode.